Good afternoon. We're here for another family conversation, our family circle. On Saturday afternoon, my name is Jerry Schnee, and I am very pleased and proud to have as my guest Therese Goodrich, the godmother of the village of Park Forest. Therese, when did you and your husband John move into Park Forest?
We came in 1954, in August of 1954. And we had one child, Joe, who was about 18 months old, and Bernie, who happens to be here, was 3 months old. So I had a little baby and we had moved from Spokane, Washington, where John had just graduated from Gonzaga University School of Law, and he took the bar exam. But he was working all those years, going to law school, and we were married. And the company that he was working for, he was there as a finance officer. They wanted him to come to Chicago, to their headquarters. And my mother said, "Chicago? Why would you move to Chicago?" I said, "Because that's where the money is." You know? But so he came out here and looked around for something to rent. And he had been, their company was located in Riverdale. It's where all those big mining offices and all of that. And so somebody came to him one day and said, "You know, there's a place a little bit farther south that they're just building called Park Forest." And so he came out and signed up. The rent was cheap. And that was the beginning.
So, 1954 in Park Forest, what was it like?
Well, it was wonderful. I fell in love with it right away. Everybody was from someplace else. There wasn't the old timers club. There were no senior citizens that you could go to say, "How do they do this?" And everybody was creating the town. If you can imagine 30 and 40-year-old veterans, some of them very, very intelligent, and some of them with PhDs, but they started a town out of nothing. And it was exciting, it was scary, but it was such a wonder.
You and John both were involved early in your life in Park Forest, weren't you?
Well, we did as much as possible during those first years, but we always loved the nonpartisan government thing. We had never been part of that before. And to see that develop and grow, and there weren't Republicans and Democrats, it was just the nonpartisan issue. And so we really actually signed up for the nonpartisan committee, and from then on, got more.
I'm reminded of what the late Henry Deach once said: there is no Democrat way to clean the streets, and there is no Republican way to pick up the garbage.
Right.
That's the basis of nonpartisan government.
Yeah.
You were involved in village government. You and John were both involved in village government, were you not?
Well,
trustees?
yes, John was a trustee, and then a couple of years, maybe 4 years later, then I got upset about something that was not going the way I thought it should. And he said, "Well, why don't you run for trustee?" And I said, "I will." I was kidding at that time, but then there was a group of women that met together, and they all kind of said the same thing, "Why don't you do it? You can do it." And I thought, well, at that time I wasn't working, so I figured I could put the time into that.
So what have you not been involved in Park Forest? I'm sure you were with the League of Women Voters, nonpartisan committee, village government.
Well, I was active with the schools right away. As our kids went into the school, I, of course, became room mother and assistant to the art teacher and things like that. But I was very involved in the school integration program. And
in 163 school
yes,
integration.
yes. And that was so neat because I got to go to meetings where there were as many black parents as there were white parents. And we all talked and visited and became great friends. And to this day, Merle Martin and I are just really, really long-time friends. And we talk about those early days, you know, and what's happened.
Well, what has happened now? You moved in 54, this is 2016, more than 60 years after the fact. What do you see in Park Forest today?
Well, of course there's a lot of differences, but I still feel the same excitement as the social issues come up because we were, you know, involved with different things within our church and with different things like with the league where you study issues and then you try to go out and help make changes where possible.
Now, your church was St. Irenaeus,
Right.
which you told me before that was here before there was a village,
Yes.
Park Forest.
And,
Tell us
and,
about that.
and that's what I want to really tell people about because it's so interesting how my family and my life revolved around the things that were happening at St. Irenaeus Church. But because it was founded so early on, I thought it would kind of give a little hole to hang all the other things that happen in Park Forest.
Well, it's your show. Go ahead.
Okay, well, the Cardinal Archbishop had heard that there was rumblings about this new town. And so in 1946, he started looking into it. And by 1948, he had selected a fairly young priest who had a different parish in the diocese, and his name was Father Elmer Coogan. Now, I hear somebody back there already chuckling, and that's usually what happens when you mention Father Coogan. He came out, and he looked around and there was nothing. He said, "What am I supposed to do here?" So he went over to Chicago Heights to St. Paul's Parish and said, "Do you have an extra room where I can stay while I find out, you know, what's going on and what's happening?" And so he actually went to American Community Builders and said, now what's the plan? What's going on? Well, by that time, they had their, you know, little business office and were starting to build a model. And so he said, well, as soon as you get some of those built, let me know because I've got to move into town in order to start this parish. And so as soon as one of the first ones were completed, Father Coogan came and moved into Park Forest. Well, so he was here when they had the tent meeting that was the big
That was
organization.
the Saturday after Thanksgiving in late November.
A cold winter day.
1948, that's
Right, right.
And bring the story there, that was the day that Bill Klutznick came up there and said, you have to build a town to govern yourself. That we, the builders, don't want to be
That's
the
right.
governors of this community.
That's right. And the thing is, if you can stop and think today, if you know anybody 30 or 40 years old who had enough gumption and courage and strength to start a new city, a new town, can you imagine what those people must have been thinking? Like, what do you mean? We're going to start a new town? But they were so excited, and fortunately, there were many, many, many good forefathers and foremothers who started this town. And in fact, after they were incorporated, which was after St. Irenaeus was incorporated, in the first election, a woman was already elected on the very, very first board of trustees.
Okay.
And so the town started with men and women both being very involved. In fact, many times the men got on the train. You know, that was the reason that Park Forest was here because the train was so close and people could get on the train and go downtown and work. but the women were here doing some of the really tough job of finding out how to make a community work. How do you get from here to there? And so the men would come home and the women would have another committee already set up saying, well, honey, I just volunteered your services to work on such or that, you know. So it was really an exciting time. Now, most of that was done before I got here, so I did not
But
do
you
the
bring up a wonderful thought that I've always had. That the men went to work, took the IC downtown to work, but the women started to run the village,
Right.
make the village better than what they saw.
Right.
So it was the backbone of the early days of the village were the women in the coffee clutches.
Right.
And the PTAs who would tell their husbands when they come home, this thing is not right, I want you to go to the board meeting and do something about it.
And the thing is that it seemed at the time that many of the people, today we'd call them social activists. In those days, they just thought that was what you do because this is how you want your town to be. And so there were good discussions, good arguments, you know, back and forth. Well, now, you know, I came from a town and here's what they did, and I came from this town and here's what they did. So the fact that everybody was from someplace else brought a wealth of good information, and they had a chance to sort out what worked and what didn't work. And I think that always has been part of what happens at Park Forest. Even today, if you go to a village meeting and one of the trustees is talking about a meeting that he or she has been at, and there's still that sense of, you know, bringing that information, bring it together, and then let it sort it out and see what's happening.
We were going back and got off the subject of St. Renee's.
Okay, well, let me tell you what happened. Okay, well, first of all, you know, this whole area was all farmland, and part of it was the Indian Wood Country Club. The entrance to Indian Wood Country Club was right up there in the corner of Western and Sock Trail. And in fact, we lived on Apple Lane for quite a while, which was just off of Sock Trail. And our neighbor across the street, her whole backyard was so beautiful. And we could never figure out how come her grass was different than everybody else's. That was the practice putting green for the country club. And they just left her because why not? If you've got grasses, that's great, you know. So she had a backyard that was just fantastic. But the rest of it was farmland, and the family farm of the Weishars was connected to the country club, and their whole farm is now Goodrich High School. So, and there are still some Weishars living in the area. There was someone that came to the Historical Society one time and talked about their family history and where this German settlement came from. So it's very interesting. Of course, in the beginning there were many problems for the early settlers. And I call them settlers because they didn't have sidewalks. They didn't have the trees, except, well, where the country club was, there were some beautiful oak trees, and they're still standing along Oak Lane. But there was even a problem with the drinking water, and I think of Flint, Michigan today, and I think, but what American Community Builders did, they delivered 5-gallon jars or jugs of water to every single rental place. Wherever there were people living, they delivered that water every week, and sometimes twice a week if they had to. And one of the stories, those things are huge and they're heavy. And one of the stories that I read about that particular incident was that Henry Leach said you could tell who were the engineers and who were the lawyers. He said the engineers got out some tubing and they got a little thing and they hooked it in there and they set it up and they just could turn on their little thing and get their water out. He said the lawyers, they lifted that jug and pumped it. They didn't have a sense of what to do with it. Of course, he was always kind of jabbing John a little bit because he was a lawyer.
Henry, for all you newcomers who haven't been here the last 50 years, was not only the village president at that time, called village president, he was also later the legal counsel for the village, and later was the Cook County Circuit Court judge.
Right.
Yes.
And was as part of the early days, first 50 years of Park Forest than anyone else was.
Yeah.
So keep on going, Therese.
Well, the courts, as you know today, we didn't have any, the houses, individual family homes were just being built. But the courts where we live were really the social center of everybody's life. And if you lived in a small court, maybe you knew somebody who was in the adjoining court, but that was where your social life was. And then maybe somebody had met somebody else, and so you get to know people in the adjoining court. And that was such an interesting phenomenon that in 1953, I think, the year before we got there, William White, who was working for for Fortune magazine, was doing research on social life and I can't remember what the other part of it. But he came out and studied Park Forest and studied how the people moved within the town and how the friendships were made, and even how some of the religions were people would come from one church and kind of tell a friend, and then they would move in. So and then his book was published then in '54, and it was called The Organization Man. And when I read that book, I had been there when he was doing all of his studying, and I thought, my gosh, is this really what Park Forest is like? Because we didn't see ourselves as organization men, as that, with that brand. But it really was true. It really was true.
Yeah, I think some of the basis of the book was the fact that these people were directed toward their companies, the organizations they served, and they went over into their social life and their home life too. That they became, rather than, they became directed toward serving other organizations.
Right. But getting back to St. Irenaeus Church, first of all, Father Coogan was a historian himself, and he loved being part of history being made. I think he realized that this was something that was going to be studied. And when he picked the name St. Irenaeus as the name for our parish, he had a real fondness for the patron who was, let me read this, was born around 130 AD, but he was the Bishop of Lyons in France, and he was one of the most distinguished theologians of the time. He's often quoted by other theologians and other historians, and he was the first one who set about studying what was happening within the church and to separate out what they called heresies. So Father Coogan was very, very intelligent, and most of the people didn't realize that because he didn't have really good social people skills. But we did. Everybody in the church did. And so he kind of got swept up and carried along with what his parish wanted to do. And the parish was always very social and community-minded. And I don't know if you know, but even today, we have the PADS program, we have the huge pantry program that serves over 100 people every Monday morning. We have a youth program, we have the, what was the other thing? But anyhow, the parish has always been very socially conscious, and
The religious observance in Park Forest was part and parcel of the growth of the village.
Right.
Before there were any churches, if I remember correctly, there was Jewish services on Friday night at the old Holiday Theater, and sometimes Saturday morning, and Sunday morning with the Protestant churches had their services there.
in fact, we called it St. Belvin and Cats. Belvin and Cats was the name of the chain of theaters all over the United States. But it wasn't too long that other churches, and of course Reverend Hugo Lineberger he was asked by American Community Buildings to come out here. They had talked with the Chicago Theological Federation and said, what's the best way to do this? We can't build 20 different churches for every kind of denomination. And so they suggested the Reverend Hugo Lineberger to come out, and he met with them, and he was of a Protestant denomination. And so as he started going around and surveying in the town, he realized that that the United Protestant Federation was probably the best way to go. And so that was how that was formed. And it had never happened anyplace else in the United States, that all of these Protestant congregations came together starting as one. Now, the Trinity Lutheran Church people said, no, we really want to build our own church and form our own congregation. And they had some help from the American Lutheran churches. And so they built the first church. Mm-hmm. And because at St. Irenaeus, what Father Coogan did, he built a school because that was what the people wanted. We came out here with kids. Everybody came out here with kids. And so the school was what his parish wanted. And within a few years, there were, let me see if I can find the actual time, there were over 850 kids at St. Irenaeus School. That was 2 classrooms of each grade. So you know that boiled down to about 100 kids, and that meant 50 kids per classroom. Those poor nuns. But I don't know, our kids got a good education, and I guess it was because in those days, every single kid respected their teacher. And what Sister said, that was,
it's interesting you talk about the growth of the religious community, because at the start, American Community Builders set aside land for these religious organizations to build on, and they had a covenant that saying these sites can never be used for commercial purposes, ever again.
And Father Coogan got the first choice.
Good enough.
That's how come the choice is right there on Orchard and Indianwood.
And then that was right across kitty corner from the old Park Forest Plaza.
Right. So that was kind of, but you know, it didn't take long for the Protestant churches to start being built, and of course many of the founders were Jewish, and they wanted to find out how do we, start to build our communities out here. And so they first had a Jewish Sunday school.
Yeah.
And what was the other day that they had? But they said they needed something for the kids and for the adults. They didn't want it just school age. They wanted it to be for the whole family.
Right.
And it wasn't long that in one of the surveys I found that in the years when Park Forest was at its peak, that it was 1/3 Catholic, 1/3 Jewish, and 1/3 Protestant. Isn't that amazing that when Park Forest had what was the number at the peak?
Oh, I would think it was well over 30,000.
Well, I think it was 32,000.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and when it was at its peak, there was a survey done.
Yeah, and of course, times change, and congregations change.
Yeah.
The old Beth Shalom Synagogue is now Hallelujah Temple.
Right.
I just found out today that Hope Lutheran, they signed the papers for the sale of Hope Lutheran Church on Inwood. It's going to be a Chicago Pentecostal church. And so it's keeping it the same price, the same way. So
there'll still be churches. There'll be churches all throughout, and that was real important because the clergy met together, and many times the combination of churches sponsored things in the parish, and they were very actively involved in the integration of the village too. And I remember at St. Irenaeus, a year before the schools became integrated, that we had a program with St. Columbanus in Chicago. And there were 20 of their students that came out on the bus every morning and went to school at St. Irenaeus. And they were all 7th and 8th graders. And their families had to agree that this was something that they would participate in. And so we had things like picnics back and forth. We would go down to St. Columbanus and they would come out here, and the families, and of course the kids needed a base family to have in case of any emergency. So we were the family for a young girl named Jennifer. And we already had a Jennifer, so that was kind of fun. But
So,
Jennifer
Therese,
Armstrong was our daughter.
you're a fountain of information about the history of Park Forest, which brings me up to another thing that you were involved in. You were for many years the president and a leader in the Park Forest Historical Society, of which I also was taking part of for a number of years. So talk to us about that.
Well, the Historical Society really was one of the few historical societies that came into being while the town was still fairly young. Usually, you don't hear of a historical society until the town's 100 years old, and then somebody says, you know, we ought to look back and find out where all the information is that, you know, when our town started. But the Historical Society really started
Even before?
1984. So the town, you know, was developing, but I think there was a sense that Park Forest was different, and we better get this information and really treasure it. Of how did it happen? All of these veterans coming home from the war, all these young families, you know, it was called a GI town at first. And so I think that that was one of the smartest things that could happen in Park Forest, was that the history of the town was kept right away. It was captured, and it is kept today. We have, for a long time, when we had the 50th birthday party in Park Forest, we opened what we call the House Museum.
It was a temporary exhibit, wasn't it?
Yes, it was supposed to be a temporary exhibit. Well, it grew and grew. But, and today it's housed in the St. Mary's school building down on Roney Road.
Two very, very large rooms.
Yes,
Right.
yes. But the archives are there too.
Right.
And some of the archives used to be right here in the library. But I want to tell you the story of the library.
Okay.
That is such an interesting story. And I'm just going to give you some highlights. In 1948 and 1949, of course, there were just a few people, you know, all coming and moving in. But the state supplied a bookmobile. And so it was all, you know, the state library said, well, this was, you know, and these were people that read. As soon as the bookmobile started, they knew that they better stock that. And each time they would have to get a bigger one and a bigger one, because the people from Park Forest really read. They do today. And so then on February 1st, 1949, the village was incorporated and an actual volunteer library was started. The state gave a whole, it was about 8 bookshelves of books to start. And what had happened before the town was incorporated, they had what was called a community council. And that was all volunteers, and they were doing those kind of things, you know, seeing about a library, seeing about transportation, seeing about, you know, all of these things that a town needs. And so on September 4th in 1952, the building where the House Museum was, over on the corner of Fir and Forest, they had one closet that was the library, and people could come and they could check out books. There would be a volunteer there, and that was in what was then the Forest Boulevard School. That was the first school in Park Forest. I have a picture on the end of this table over here of one classroom, or one group of kids from a class in the Boulevard School. And it was so interesting because one time a teacher brought a group of kids over to the House Museum, and we had a little schoolroom set up. And she was looking and looking, and she saw one picture, and she went, "Oh!" And the kids all turned around, you know, what is our teacher looking at? She found her own picture on the wall, and that was Pat Ransford. Pat Ransford was a twin, and she found her and her twin picture in with a group of kids playing on the slide that was out in the back of Forest Boulevard School. So it was like, oh my gosh, you know, things really just continue and continue. But then the Volunteer Library Association was formed, and they decided that they needed to go to the village and say, we want a library, a real library. And so on March 26, 1955, Park Forest voted by a margin of 7.5 to 1 to do a levy for a library building. And the library opened first in the village hall in November of 1955. And the first librarian was hired, and that was Leona Ringering. And if you notice that the room in back behind there is the Ringering room that was named after Leona. And then on May of 1957, a bond issue for $160,000 was approved, and they were able to start building. And of course, this was the corner, and I don't know how many additions from the first one. The first building was just that front part, and I think there have been 2 additions after that. And so the library right away was inundated, and people wanted more and more and more books. And one of the things that happened, besides joining the suburban library system, is that the basement of the library, which was fairly new and fresh and everything, became the home to the Park Forest Art Center. And the Park Forest Art Center had been over behind Stricker's Hardware on Money Road, if you know where that building is over there. And they just had one big room back there. And so they moved all of their things down to the lower level of the library. And weren't there stairs over here?
There were stairs down there.
Because there wasn't an elevator,
Yes,
so we had to do that move just, you know, up and down the stairs.
And after the art center moved, it was home to the Illinois Theater Center.
In 1976,
Right.
the Park Forest, it was still Park Forest Art Center, and moved over to Freedom Hall. And then Tell and Steve Billig opened the Illinois Theater Center. They came from home, they had lived here for years, but they were out in Omaha, Nebraska, and they moved back when they found out that they could start the Illinois Theater Center. So it was in the lower level, and people had to come in and for the performances and go down, and then they did use the outside stairwell sometimes. And I don't know when the elevator was put in, but we never used it. We always used the stairs.
Exercise.
Yes. And then from January 1980 through 1981, a special grant was given to the Park Forest Library, and they sponsored the old Park Forest. This was the oral history of Park Forest. And all of those founders people were trained on how to interview them. And so they set up the microphones and got everything ready, and there were about 30 people who were the really founding forefathers and foremothers of Park Forest who were interviewed. And these oral histories were then preserved. And they still are here. I don't know, do we still have them in the library?
Yes.
No. Well,
Yes, some of them are.
some of them are.
Because they've been transcribed so that you can sit down and read them. And I have to tell you, one of the first ones that I read was when Father Coogan was interviewed. And I just laughed and laughed and laughed. He was really a curmudgeon. But I mean, I knew him through and through. So I knew him as a historian, because anytime we'd sit down and visit, we'd always end up talking history. But he had something about him that was like, you had to break through this crusty old man before you found the real sentimental guy inside.
The oral history is still an ongoing project. I want to mention two things. If you remember that Susie Brown did the oral history of the veterans of World War II, when the Historical Society had their annual Veterans Day programs, and where veterans of World War II would come down and tell them what it was like in war and coming back to Park Forest afterwards. And there are about 60 or 65 oral histories that are on cassette tapes that are being transcribed onto CDs as we speak.
You know, we should see about those being sent to the National Archives, because they're doing the same thing, and it should include our oral histories too.
Speak to the president.
I'll say, hey, Barack, what you doing today? But then the library celebrated its 40th anniversary in 1955, and then a little later on, they did the digital project that was sponsored by the Illinois State Library to educate and automate, which was a grant for $39,500 to digitize the photographs and documents and oral history and everything. So I don't know, Park Forest has a special knack of giving wonderful grants. And even today, you know, there is somebody over there at the Village Hall that really knows when the grants become available, how they can be used. And, you know, those are the things, that's our money, so why not have it come to Park Forest and use it the way that best suits all of us. And so the rest is kind of, well, in June of 2004, the Family Technology Center ribbon cutting was done, and the Friends of the Library donated funds, and Van Kampen Investments donated furniture. So we're always still looking to find another donation.
Let me ask you a question. You've been here since '54. You've raised your family here. Is there anything that you have not done that you still want to do in the village? Or
I don't know. I don't think so. You know, I think that one of the things, of course, that disturbs me is what's happened to so many of our people who had lost their jobs during all these hard times that we've had, and houses that were foreclosed. And one of the things that I would like to see happen, I still have the artist in my heart a lot of the time. I would love to see an artist community established in Park Forest. And that way, the artists that are now working here and there and off, you know, by themselves, this has happened with about 3 or 4 places in the United States. And they have a small one in Chicago where they have one building where artists have their studios and they also live there. But I look at some of these homes in Park Forest and I think, I wonder if there's enough of them on one cul-de-sac or one street or one area that we could convince these, I don't know whether they're still starving artists, but that we could have a real arts community. We have, you know, tall grass, and we have that beautiful gallery that is becoming, you know, nationwide known because they have, you know, shows where people come from all over the country to exhibit. But I thought, oh, wouldn't it be neat to get some of those artists to come and live here and have a home and a studio and where they could meet with other artists and have discussions and reflections. And it seems that Park Forest is the kind of town that should have that. So that's my next thing.
very good. On that basis, I'd like to open up the discussion. Any questions that anyone from the audience would have? Anyone have something to ask Therese? Yes.
I went to Valparaiso University I graduated in 1959, and I took sociology courses there. And in sociology courses, it talked about Park Forest, you know, and I'm you know, you mentioned about something, I guess with GIs or so, and everything. And so I find this interesting, the connection here, and which spread all over the country about Park Forest.
Well,
sociology courses.
There are many sociology courses where a student will come out and visit either here at the library or with the Historical Society and do their research, because we have wonderful, wonderful archives. And just the other day, I was talking with our director, and she said that students from the University of Chicago had come down, and they wanted to drive around town too. And so, and they were studying the architecture of the town.
Yeah, I remember that too about University of Chicago being connected with Park Forest.
Right.
I may add that after World War II, the returning veterans were faced with an enormous housing shortage, and when they came back there, the trick was that some landlords would give them a small rent payment, but they would have to buy $4,000 worth of furniture to get in the house. So there was a tremendous shortage, post-World War II shortage, and Bill Putznick and Nathan Manilow and Bieber and Sweet Carol Sweet decided what they wanted to do was have some sort of community that would involve the veterans, give veterans decent housing. I think a 2-bedroom, at the time then they set up where a 2-bedroom rental unit would be $85 a month.
That's what we moved into.
And for that time, it was an enormous, and it was good housing.
That tile in the bathroom was ceramic tile. You know, this wasn't plastic tile, and these were hardwood floors. We were amazed.
As far as I know, all the 2,000 or so homes that were rental units that were built are still occupied, except for 2 which burned down about 4 years ago.
Right. And Mary?
Well, I was just going to mention, if I remember correctly, Park Forest is one of the few totally planned communities
Right.
across the U.S., which made it also quite unique for sociological study, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, it was also the first World War II, it may have been the first planned community that did it without federal funds.
Ah.
Right. Because there was another town out east that was called Levittown, but they didn't do the same kinds of things. Levittown, the people didn't start their government. And the people weren't as involved in, I mean, socially they may have been, but the town was
Well, it was, there were, basically the Levittowns were communities or areas in the community that were built by this William Levitt.
right.
And so, but they were basically part of other communities.
Right.
They were built, in fact, the original homes in Eastgate were based on the Levittown homes in the east.
But wasn't one of the other distinguishing factors the variety of housing?
Yes.
And the spaces set aside for churches, schools,
Right.
et cetera. I remember the the schools and parks are adjacent. Was
Right.
that part of the original plan?
Right,
Yeah.
and the other reason was, and the other thing they did, there were no straight streets in Park Forest.
Well, the ones that were already here, Western and
Right.
Dot Trail.
But there were no straight
That's
streets.
right.
What they said was they wanted, because the children would be involved, crossing the streets and going to schools, so they wanted the traffic to slow down. That was then.
And people would always get lost in Park Forest. Yeah.
There's 3 books are written on Park Forest. One is Jerry's picture book. I got that first because I don't read.
Thank you.
We have a copy of it sitting at the end of
And
the
this
table.
one here,
Oh,
the
Greg
original
Grant.
GI Town, it's probably in the library.
Yeah.
So if anybody wants to find it. And the third one was, of course, William White's book on
Right.
Preposition Man.
There's a 4th book. There's a 4th book. It doesn't have Park Forest in there. It's a kind of a very, very detailed history of church building.
Oh, it does have Park Forest.
Yeah, but there's a lot of Park Forest, but it's not the main focus of the book.
Oh, no, it's how the religions were established throughout
Right.
the
But
Midwest.
Park Forest gets a good share of the attention by the book's authors.
Right.
But that's a recent book.
Yes, that's, in fact, it's written by one of the professors from Valparaiso.
Oh, really?
Yes, and she came out here and did a lot of research. So, and I think she kind of started to like Park Forest, so pretty soon besides a chapter on the religions of Park Forest, you find that throughout the book, she keeps referring back to that, comparing it to what happened in other towns. Do you have a question?
I live in Stagers. When we used to come here for mushrooms, when this was just territory. And then I had a wonderful experience of teaching here. And my first job was at the school, and I think it was my superintendent. And I had many, many wonderful students, and I keep in touch with them still because of Facebook, you know.
Does everybody here know Marie Eichel?
I taught grade school. I taught grades 4 and 5, and prior to that, I was with the Defense Department and taught in Italy. And I got a letter from the superintendent wondering when I'm coming back and if I would take a job. And I said I thought I would stay another year with the Defense Department. So then he sent me another letter, and I didn't even interview, and they put me at the Lakewood. And it was a wonderful experience. Parents and kids were great. We did many wonderful things together. And then the gifted program came out, and the government gave us money to start a gifted program. And along with Jean Bernstein and Marilyn Tannenbaum, and I did the art, and Marilyn and Jean did the language arts, we began the gifted program
Right.
in Park Forest. And that's,
It's interesting that you mentioned Lakewood School, because Lakewood School was located right across the street. And a few years ago, when they started this new development, my husband and I we knew some of the people through the school who were getting ready to sign off on it and go. Of course, then it had to be sold to the village, so the village would sell it to the developer and all that. But we looked at some of the plans and we said, my gosh, they're building this for us.
There you go.
So we were, Jean Bernstein and ourselves were the first ones that moved into, this is the place there. And as a matter of fact, one of the streets is called Schoolhouse Court. And the main street that we live on is called Cunningham Drive. And that was named after Barney Cunningham, who was a long, long time president of the village of Park Forest.
And president of the library board.
And president of the library board for even longer.
Even longer.
Yeah.
I must say, for anyone who doesn't know, Marie Iafolo and is as well as this charming lady here, are members of the Park Forest Historical Society Hall of Fame. And we have a new inductee that's going to take place in April. That's Mary Bertozzi and her late husband Mary are going to be inducted. So we have a kind of royalty of Park Forest here.
You're all invited to come to the Hall of Fame. It's going to be
April 10th
April 10th.
at Freedom Hall.
Sunday afternoon at Freedom Hall. That was one of the things that the Historic Society decided to do, because there were so many people who not only made the name for themselves, but who carried Park Forest farther and farther out into the world. And a lot of these people are very, very famous today. Other ones are, like myself, they just decided to stay in Park Forest.
Didn't have anyone else nominated that, right? What did you ever do?
Anybody could do it.
The first inductee in the Hall of Fame was Phil Plutzik, and that was in '89, and that was kind of a lay fallow for about 5 years, and they started an annual induction in 1994.
And the thing is, it's always interesting to me when we read the directions or the instructions of what people have to do to nominate. It has to be somebody who's not famous, but who made a long-term, dedicated contribution to Park Forest. And that's a little different than somebody that's famous.
However, there are more than 150 so far in the Hall of Fame since 1994. So there are a lot of people that have done a lot of wonderful things for the village. And Therese, I want to thank you very much for taking part in our family circle conversation today.
Thank you.
It's been, how long have we known each other?
Oh, it's been a long time.
I don't even want to mention that.
We've celebrated birthdays and anniversaries and
That's right.
good times and hard times.
As I said, this is the godmother for the village of Park Forest. Is there anything that she hasn't done? And I have yet to discover anything, or anyone that has not been in touch with Therese Goodrich.
Well, if you live long enough, it just happens.
Thank you very much, my dear.